I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Now, today we're reading from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 10, and let's focus on verses 18 and 19. Then the glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the temple and stood over the cherubim. And the cherubim lifted their wings and mounted up from the earth in my sight. And when they went out, the wheels were beside them. And they stood at the door of the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. Now, one time I lived in a neighborhood where the homes were all built in the 1950s. And so I know that termites eventually make their way into every residence. And one morning on my way to a coffee house where I studied the Bible, I noticed a house in my neighborhood had been tented by an exterminating company. You see, when termites are discovered, the worst case scenario is that the owners must evacuate the structure for a weekend while exterminators cover the home with a tent, and then they fill the house with a potent gaseous pesticide. And after the smoke clears, literally, the occupants may return home. And this is a good picture of what today's chapter is communicating. Because of the nagging, destructive presence of sin in his house, God is leaving home for a God-sized weekend while his exterminators get to work. And what needs to be grasped is that this is worse than any of God's judgments thus far. The presence of a God who judges, however terrible his rebuke might be, indeed, his presence is preferable to the absence of God and his mercy. God's presence is his most treasured gift. It is at the heart of his promises, i.e., his covenants with his people. In Psalm 23, David says, "You are with me." And we get the sense that it was the truth that David cherished most. No matter what happens, I'm just glad God's here. Other Bible writers echoed that thought. Matthew 28, we learned that God is with us. Psalms 34 and 139 tell us that God is around us. In John 14:7, we learned that God reveals himself to us. He is in the midst of us in Psalm 46, verse 5. Underneath us in Deuteronomy 33. He is near us in Psalm 147 or 148. He is before us in John chapter 10. Most importantly, God promises never to leave or to forsake his children. Hebrews 13, verse 5. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, "I will never leave you, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." You see, what do I have if I don't have any money? You have something better than money. You have God, who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. In essence, because God is everywhere, he can never truly leave. But even so, some aspects of God's presence may be well withdrawn, even from God's people. He may remove all perception or visibility so that we may not feel as though he's present. He may decide to withdraw his help, as Samson discovered with Delilah. But what happens here in Ezekiel 10 is of a different order. Here, God is withdrawing from his temple, the place where the people went for comfort. Well, I'll just go be with God for a little bit. I'm sorry, God's not here. Today's chapter gives us a better insight as to the seriousness of God's warnings in Revelation 3, where God threatens to fight against the Pergamum church because of their moral and their spiritual deviances. And then later in Revelation 3, he threatens to spit the Laodicean church out of his mouth because of their lukewarmness. You see, not all who say, "Lord, Lord," follow him as he requires. God clearly distinguishes between the true church and the synagogues of Satan, as it were. And in such cases, where the congregation ceases to be his and their practices, will go ahead and place a sign over the door inscribed Ichabod, which in Hebrew means God has departed. We should walk closely with the Lord. We should be covered in his dust, as it were. And we should be thankful for more than we have ever perhaps even perceived. And the Great Commission where Jesus says, "And lo, I am with you always." Be in the Lord and walk according to his word. He is a holy God, and he will rebuke even his children. I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Now, Groundworks Ministries operates entirely through financial donations from faithful people just like you. And yes, we do need your monthly support. Donating is secure and it's easy at our website, groundworksministries.com. You know, another way to help us is just tell people about Groundworks Ministries. Just talk about us. Share these podcasts with friends and family and on your social media. And of course, you can always direct folks to our website, groundworksministries.com.